What I'm going to be talking about is basically shelter-in-place alternatives. I've done a lot about Corona versus Liberty, and even you, Pete, kind of suggested that I should be looking at some more alternatives to this rather than just kind of complaining about it. So I'm going to do that. So in order to put some perspective into this, we have some breaking news from my state because I am in Arizona. And this is the latest state, as far as I know, this is the latest statewide shelter in place order that's come out because this came out literally like 30 minutes ago, or less than an hour ago. This came out. So Governor Ducey of the state of Arizona has issued a policy that he's calling "Stay Home, Stay Healthy, Stay Connected." Interestingly enough, I saw some of his his briefing, his press conference, and he said he did not want to use the term shelter in place. And he said specifically because that conjures images of a nuclear war, that conjures images of a active shooter situation, and he doesn't want to use that term. And I will say, we've reviewed the text of these types of orders before. We talked about the LA order, which kind of really started all this, the LA order. We talked about the California order and some others that we've shown here on the air. But this is the state of Arizona's actual executive order. And the interesting thing to keep in mind is that before this order was issued, the governor of Arizona actually defined what was critical, what the critical jobs in Arizona would be. And what he was doing there, and I knew what he was doing, he was trying to head off the more liberal cities. The basically here it's Flagstaff, Tucson, then Phoenix. They're like dominoes. Flagstaff starts, and then Tucson does it, and then Phoenix does it. That's kind of going to be our pattern, I think. And the governor decided to kind of head them off at the pass, and so he defined what was critical. And so, in doing this isn't in fact a shelter-in-place order. He didn't call it that, but it is a shelter-in-place order. It does have the force of law, including criminal implications. You can be charged with a misdemeanor for violating this. But I did find it interesting that the order specifically states that a warning has to be given and people have to be given the opportunity to comply before any enforcement action is taken. It's actually in the language of the order. But we have in here essential activities. And this is something that the governor set up earlier in a previous executive order. He set up what essential activities are for the state of Arizona. So as of tomorrow close of business, which is 8 p.m., these are the things that people in the state of Arizona can do legally under this authority. So we have obtaining necessary supplies and services for family, household members, and pets, things like groceries, food supplies, household consumption, equipment needed to work from home, assignments for completion of distance learning, and products necessary to maintain safety, sanitation, essential maintenance of the home and residence. Other activities include maintaining basically safety for family, household members, and pets. Things such as seeking medical, behavioral health, or emergency services, obtaining medical supplies, caring for a family member, friend, or pet in another household or residence, which includes but not limited to transportation of family member, friend, or pet. Engage outdoor exercise. This was a big one, such as walking, hiking, running, biking, or golfing, but only if appropriate physical distance precautions were used. The governor was criticized for adding golfing. Golfing, of course, is big in the state of Arizona, but golfing also, you can have lots of space golfing. So one of the things he emphasized was that he wanted to make sure people were able to exercise because every single health expert will tell you one of the best ways to deal with corona is to be in good shape. There's all sorts of evidence that your BMI will kill you, that with corona, your BMI can kill you. There's all sorts of emerging evidence saying that. So attending or conducting work or volunteering in essential functions, which includes but is not limited to transporting children to childcare services or attending work, an essential service. And I like this one. I do like this one. Engaging in constitutionally protected activities such as speech and religion and any legal or court process provided that such is conducted in a manner that provides appropriate physical distancing to the extent feasible. I really like this. I don't think I've seen this in any of the other orders. where he specifically says your right to assemble and your right to worship is there. We are not going to cross that line, and it is written in stone under our governor's order that that freedom of speech and freedom of religion are exceptions to this rule. And I really applaud him for that, because other people, I saw Blasio, the mayor of New York, I saw where he actually said that they are going to shut down churches if they don't comply. He said permanently. I think that was a slip of the tongue, but that's what he said. We're going to shut down churches permanently if they violate these orders. But the governor here is saying, at least as far as the punitive enforcement action, the class 1 misdemeanor, you cannot charge a priest or a chaplain or any religious person for this, and you cannot do this for protests. You know what I mean? What they're going to do is try to make people keep their distance and things like that. So I was a little bit encouraged by that. We have a fairly broad definition, and we do have our basic constitutional liberties of freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, still enshrined in this order. So that's one thing I found encouraging, because I don't think other governors are doing that, at least from what I've seen. And they may. I'm not trying to speak for all of them, because you have to look at each order. You know what I mean? You have to look at the text of each one of these kind of shelter-in-place orders. So this is probably, I guess I would say, kind of the best you can get. But as I wanted to say, I have some alternatives here. And the model that I really want to look at is what's happening in the richer Asian countries, the ones that are actually doing much better. And we have to keep some context in mind, okay? South Korea was one of the first countries hit by corona. They've been dealing with this just about almost as long as China, quite frankly. They were hit early because they border North Korea. We know North Korea is, who knows what's going on in North Korea right now with this virus. But we know it passed through there. And we know that, of course, South Korea has very close ties to China, physically and in terms of diplomacy and business. So they were hit almost immediately. So this is an NPR article. This is from March 26, and it says, how South Korea reined in the outbreak without shutting everything down. It says, as of this week, South Korea had just over 9,000 confirmed corona cases, which puts it among the top 10 countries for total cases. I think I don't know if they're still in the top 10, honestly. But I do know that number is still pretty much it. They plateaued. They're basically still at 9,000. This is of a couple days ago. It says, but South Korea has another distinction. Health experts are noting that recently the nation has managed to significantly slow the number of new cases. And the country appears to have reined in the outbreak without some of the strict lockdown strategies deployed elsewhere in the world. We've seen examples in places like Singapore, South Korea, where governments haven't had to shut everything down. This is from Mike Ryan, the head of the World Health Organization's Health Emergencies Program. It says they've been able to make tactical decisions regarding schools, tactical decisions regarding movements, and been able to move forward without some of the draconian measures. Draconian. This is someone from the World Health Organization, by the way. Speaking this week to journalists, Ryan said the countries that have tested widely for the virus, isolated cases, and quarantined suspected cases, in the way that South Korea and Singapore have done, have managed to suppress transmission of the virus. President Trump has also praised South Korea's handling of the health crisis and even asked President Moon Jae-in, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering that, for help with medical equipment to fight the outbreak in the United States. The head of the WHO, which I cannot pronounce his name, I apologize for that, I probably should with all the time he's been in the media, has called on other countries around the world to apply the lessons learned in South Korea and elsewhere in their own battles against the coronavirus. South Korea's foreign minister, Kang Kyung-hwa, speaking to the BBC last week, said the key lessons from her country are that it developed testing for the virus even before it had a significant number of cases. In mid-January, our health authorities quickly conferred with the research institutions here to develop a test, Kang said. And then they shared that result with the pharmaceutical companies, who then produced a chemical and the equipment needed for the testing. So when members of the religious sect in, and I don't know this region, this city or region, started getting sick in February, so there you go, this started in February, South Korea was able to rapidly confirm that it was COVID-19. Testing is central to the outbreak response, said King, because that leads to early detection. It minimizes further spread and allows health authorities to quickly isolate and treat those found with the virus. It says Hong Kong and Singapore have followed similar paths in responding to this outbreak. They've used testing aggressively to identify cases, not only testing people who are so sick that they're hospitalized, but also mild cases and even suspected cases. They've quarantined tens of thousands of people who may have been exposed to confirmed cases. The vast majority of the people ordered to quarantine at home are perfectly healthy and never do get sick. By the way, keep that in mind. The vast majority of the people ordered to quarantine at home are perfectly healthy and never do get sick. They're just infected. But the few who do develop symptoms can be quickly isolated further. Tedros of the WHO refers to this as cutting off the virus at the bud, basically stopping the virus from spreading further and preventing community transmission. Hong Kong also reacted with incredible speed to the outbreak's early days. On December 31st, 2019, Hong Kong's Center for Health Protection, the city's health department, sent out an alert to its doctors telling them to be on the lookout for patients presenting with fever, acute respiratory illness, pneumonia, or shortness of breath, which I think we all know that now. Fever, shortness of breath, that's out now. In particular, patients with these symptoms who've recently traveled to the Chinese city of Wuhan, the initial epicenter of the pandemic. Prior to this crisis, a high-speed rail line went directly from downtown Hong Kong to Wuhan. Think about that. Hong Kong had a high-speed rail line directly to the epicenter of this outbreak, and yet they are nowhere near where we're at. Nowhere near. And they started having problems in this late December. Think about that. The other thing that South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore have in common is that they've been able to keep most factories, shopping malls, and restaurants open. You hear that? South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore have been able to keep their factories, shopping malls, and restaurants open. Singapore has even kept schools open at a time when nations around the world are shutting down classrooms. Put some perspective on that. Singapore is basically a big city. It is like the one true city-state on this planet. It is a big city, very close to China, very close ties to China, and they're controlling this.
Hong Kong also is in it.
Hong Kong is attached to China, at least the outer territories is attached to China. The rest of Hong Kong is an island. But I mean, these places are small. These are, like I said, Singapore is the one true city-state in the world, and they're controlling this when they're right there at the epicenter. Japan is another Asian country notable for its response. Although Japan has more than twice the population of South Korea and also has strong ties to China, it has recorded only a fraction of the cases that South Korea has, just over 1,000 as of Thursday. Japan hadn't been testing nearly as widely as South Korea, but it appears to have fended off significant community transmission by quickly investigating any flare-up cases, identifying who exactly is infected, and then monitoring their contacts. It says, despite the success in Asia in containing the virus, recently several places have seen surges in imported cases from Europe. That's called, it's basically like blowback. So in other words, their numbers are going up because they're repatriating their people from places like Italy that are infested right now. So the Europeans are giving it back to them. If you can believe that, we're like in bizarro world. This week, after Singapore saw an uptick in cases among people who'd recently flown into the country, it announced new restrictions on travelers, blocking all short-term visitors from entering. Because basically, Singapore is getting infected by Europe. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy what's happening. Part of the reason for the tougher border measures is to ensure we keep Hong Kong as safe as possible. That's from Singapore's Minister of Education, Ong Ye Kung. He wrote this week in a Facebook post. He said the highly restrictive entry rules are so that daily activities like going to work, eating out, and attending school can go on. Singapore is not what you call a free society. They're like a quasi-democracy, if that, okay? And look at their attitude. Because we want to keep people working, eating, and attending school. We want to keep people in somewhat of a normal life. And this is another interesting point from the Minister of Education from Singapore. He said, he argued that children are safer and more productive in school, and that closing schools places a significant burden on working adults, including health workers. Quote, keeping our healthcare system strong is paramount in the fight against COVID-19, he said. Our frontline warriors will be much more assured if their children are in school, meaningfully engaged in a safe and healthy environment. It's an interesting perspective, and it's one that you don't hear. He's also pushed back against the idea that schools could be breeding grounds for the virus, saying there is little evidence to show that the young are vectors or spreaders of the virus. Now, get this. He says the reverse appears to be the case, where the young get infected by adults at home. And it says health agencies such as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention do note that even though children may often present with milder symptoms in adults, there is much more to be learned about how the disease impacts children. So there's a lot of good stuff in this article. This really does show you a different perspective and a possible path forward. I did want to just share this really quick because I know I'm going with a lot of time here, but I just wanted to share also another thing Singapore is doing. Now, this I think would be a little bit more controversial. There we go. All right. So another thing Singapore is doing, and by the way, I know South Korea is doing something similar. They have an app called Trace Together. Okay, Singapore has launched an app called Trace Together to boost COVID-19 contact tracing efforts. This is from channelnewsasia.com. This is where the article comes from. They have a new mobile application called Trace Together. It's launched on Friday, March 20th, to support ongoing contact tracing efforts amid the COVID-19 outbreak in Singapore. So by downloading the app and consenting, this is interesting too, because remember, Singapore is not considered 100% a democracy. They're basically like a one-party system, okay? So I think a good analogy is kind of like the PRI used to be in Mexico, where they always won the election like every single time. That's kind of where Singapore is at. So by downloading the app and consenting to participate in it, Trace Together allows users to proactively help in the contact tracing process. So let me get to where it explains what it does. So after giving consent during the setup of the app, users will need to turn on their Bluetooth, as well as enable push notifications and location permissions. The app works by exchanging short-distance Bluetooth signals between phones to detect other users of the app who are in close proximity. And close proximity is 2 meters apart, or up to 5 meters for 30 minutes. That's what their definition of close contact is. It says records of these encounters will be stored locally in the user's phones and will not be sent to authorities. Users will only be asked to share these records when contacted by the Ministry of Health as part of contact tracing investigations. If they refuse, they may be prosecuted under the Infectious Disease Act. So currently, contact tracing relies on the memory of interviewees. However, there have been instances where interviewees could not remember all their contacts or did not have information about people they had been in contact with. So I just wanted to present that. I know that there are definitely civil liberty issues with something like that, but at the same time, I think it's a lot better than shelter in place. And they do have some controls, and we're talking about Singapore here. I would like to know more about South Korea's app, because South Korea is a true constitutional, democratic constitutional is a true democratic constitutional republic. Okay, whereas Singapore is kind of like like I said, it's kind of like Mexico used to be, where the PRI wins every election. That's kind of where Singapore is right now. But right. So I would like to know more about South Korea. Go ahead, Pete. I'm sorry.
For several decades, they were under essentially a dictatorship of Lee Kuan Yew. So yeah, to even call them a one-party state is to overstate it. They were a one-man state for a very long time.
But currently they're sort of regarded more as like I said, kind of like a one-party state. They're again. I think it's analogous to the way Mexico used to be with the PRI. They always won every election, so we kind of knew the fix was in. Other people could run, but they always won. So, but still, Singapore is still a freer I would say, a freer country than, say, China. You know what I mean? And it's just interesting that even with that, whether that argument is correct or not, it's interesting to me that even this app, it is voluntary. You know what I mean? As far as the permissions that you give it, it's just that once you're in the program you're in, and it's something to consider. And like I said, I would like to know more about the South Korean version because I know they're doing something very similar, and I don't know much about their particular app. I do know Apple came out with an app that's supposed to help with like screening, basically screening yourself, which is not a bad idea because we are having a testing gap. I do think apps can help with that as a diagnostic tool. But anyway, those are some alternatives and some places in the world that are still free. It's interesting to say Singapore is freer than the United States right now.
Well, thank you for that report, Eric. That was really awesome. There was so much good information, and there was one thing I wanted to jump in, but you were on such a one of the people that I think Seraphim Larson. He's the former chairman of the Pinal County Republicans. So that's just outside of Maricopa County, just outside of the Phoenix area in Arizona. He's the former chairman, and he's Greek Orthodox. He's a leader, appears to be a leader both in his church and in the community here in Arizona. He was circulating a petition to protect religious liberty in Arizona. And so I thought it was wonderful that, as you said, Governor Ducey's order protected freedom of religion in ways that a lot of these left-wing mayors and left-wing governors, a lot of these Democrats simply haven't. Governor Northam in Virginia essentially has outlawed church services. His no more than 10 people rule applies to churches just as much as it does to a bar or a restaurant.